Hey, welcome to another episode of Natural Right with extra fries. Okay. Purim's approaching, so I'm very giddy. The previous two videos amount essentially to this. The ancients came to hold to a difference between nature and convention, with the former being considered the good. Now, the video before this one touched upon justice. Does the law serve the common good? Is there really such a thing as a common good, and do the laws and the rulers serve it? As well as the question of, can humanity as a whole have a common good to begin with? Very, very relevant questions today, not only in terms of our crisis of thought, but in terms of our globalized world, which is very much connected to that, certainly. But the conventionalists deny these things, that both the causality of the good and the just, as well as the notion of a common good to begin with, because their assumption is that the natural is the good and the nature is individual, which we'll see in this video. And of course that happened later, but it was that way for at least some of the ancients, as we'll see. And hence any good in common is as such conventional to begin with. And I refer here to the end of the last video, which featured a brief examination of citizenship, about what makes a citizen and how a citizen is different from a slave and so on. I pushed back on this particular example of the gang of robbers, which illustrates the insufficiency, supposedly illustrates the insufficiency of an appeal to common interests, suggesting that the city is the place where man can achieve a very good personal good indeed, namely philosophy, and in this way the city does differentiate itself from a gang of robbers, for instance, or whatever kind of commonsensically unjust association that does have rules and common interest. So law has fallen into our magnifying glass. So the discussion then turns to Plato, who was alluded to numerous times in this chapter, where he explains a little more closely the premise of conventionalism he alluded to much earlier, namely that nature is the standard. He goes into a little argument there, which that we seem to desire things contrary to our customs, and hence not because of our customs, but rather by nature. We desire what pleases us and avoid what harms us. Hence, the unconventional pleasures must be the naturally pleasant. This needs unpacking, which is something that I haven't been doing often enough. I've more been sort of summarizing, being a bit too passive in this whole thing, so I'll try to unpack this. Desire for pleasure and aversion to pain appear to be the things drawing us away from custom. That's what Strauss says. That's the wording. Hence, pleasure would appear to be the natural good. Pleasure hence becomes the first substitute for tradition. And there's a little quote here. I promised you I was going to read the footnotes together with you, so here it is. So that is the Republic 364a 2-4. We'll just do 364a. Furthermore, Socrates, says Adeimantus, consider still another form of speeches about justice and injustice, spoken in prose and by poets. With one tongue they all chant that moderation and justice are fair, but hard and full of drudgery. What a great word. While intemperance and injustice are sweet and easy to acquire, and shameful only by opinion and law. They say that the unjust is for the most part more profitable than the just, and both in public and in private. They are ready and willing to call happy and to honor bad men who have wealth or some other power, and to dishonor and overlook those who happen in some way to be weak or poor, although they agree that they are better than the others. That is the portion. Let me see whether I got that latter part, both in public and in private. The sophists would do it in public, I suppose. They are ready and willing to call happy and to honor bad men who have wealth or some other power, and to dishonor and overlook those who happen in some way to be weak and poor. All right, yeah, because justice is the what do you say? It's the pact of bugmen. That's the sophistic teaching. or at least which is sort of vulgarly downstream from philosophical conventionalism. But that's what this video is going to discuss. Okay, so that is it doesn't describe so much pleasure becoming a standard, but it's just they discuss this teaching here that the opinion and law are in the way of enjoyable things, and if you cheat on these things, then you have more of those things, and that's very great according to these people who have that teaching. I'm reading Alan Bloom's version, or I have read Alan Bloom's translation and commentary, which is very good, insofar I understand it, and that of which I do not understand, I believe it to be very good also. That's a reference to a conversation you'll never hear. The argument is intentionally watery and without firm conclusion. We are apparently supposed to believe that the ancients made an initial substitute, whatever later substitutes were, perhaps reason, on account of appearances. And perhaps that has to indicate the simplicity of hedonism, or perhaps there's no or some other implication here. But I think it's all phrased a little too with too little firmness. There's a lot of appearances and substituting, which has a sort of arbitrary connotation. I don't know. Strauss says that the most developed root of conventionalism is Epicureanism. Its materialistic aspect is highlighted as the key aspect of Platonic criticism of conventionalism. And I'll just say as an aside here that the rabbis at the time of the Greek occupation of Israel thought more or less the same thing, funnily enough. So here's the rendition of the Epicureanism. The good is found in the common denominator regardless of opinion, which are the senses. That which we seek naturally is what we call good because it is sensed as such. Good is hence bodily pleasure and therefore private. Because the body senses and the body is bounded, therefore private. There are three kinds of pleasures. The first is unadulterated pleasure. The second is the useful, which can be painful but is itself a means to pleasure. The third is the noble, which is pleasant because it's praised, and it is hence based on opinion. Virtue naturally produces pleasure, though justice only does so by being acknowledged by others, and hence is conventional. And it is not altogether clear how he thinks courage could be pleasant without praise. Perhaps Epicurus doesn't consider courage to be a virtue. I don't know, I haven't read the guy, obviously. But, okay, so there's that. So justice to him is based on calculation, but unlike other forms of association, such as friendship, it requires compulsion and is hence unpleasant. Though it might be a means to the pleasant, but only if it's acknowledged, whereas natural virtue, quote-unquote, does this thing all by itself. Which is... yeah, okay, there's those assumptions there. I don't have to pick those apart because it's said that these are assumptions. And, I don't know why he assumes those. I don't know if he has arguments, but that's how that is. That's fine. Strauss makes the big claim that the Lucretian poem on the nature of things, which I'm not going to read because it's too long, and I don't actually have it, is in fact the only authentic and comprehensive conventionalist document. And he summarizes it. It's basically you have these forest dwellers; those are the original men, and they establish a society for the sake of security, which sounds to me sort of like Socrates' so-called city of sows, or the healthy city. Perhaps Plato was alluding to Lucretius there. I don't know exactly the chronology of it. I think Plato did come after him. Probably should have done some research. Cities are what comes after that. So the city of souls would contain a sort of pattern of true natural right, if this way of organizing was natural. But philosophy here is said to be the natural way of life, which does not exist in a healthy city. The healthy city only has, it has food, it has people just associating benevolently without really thinking. But philosophy can only exist in a city. And boy, here's the problem. Because the happy society, according to this Lucretian teaching, could not continue to exist because mankind discovered reasons for existential angst. They erected temples and malls to save them from that angst, but philosophy requires reserved acknowledgement of their delusions. Life according to nature, which is life according to the study of a finally lifeless and neutral nature, atoms, is hence incompatible with the attachments of the city to the brimming, enchanted world that we want to remain in. My thoughts, what stands out immediately is the fact that, at least from the way Strauss sketches it here, again, I don't have the poem or book or whatever, mankind somehow has to become itself. Because there's this assumption that, or this teaching that philosophy is really the greatest natural good for man. Therefore, it is a good that is proper to man. Therefore, man becoming most himself is man being in a city and philosophizing. But the city contradicts that because there's a state of nature but mankind falls from that. So there's a sort of initial perfection, and then you fall from that. For Lucretius, there are really two falls. The first is the realization of natural unsafety or scarcity or whatever it may be, which might directly come out of a process that leads to natural scarcity or some sort of increase or decrease in safety and resources, respectively. That's sort of interesting to consider in light of Rousseau and the historical process and so on. I have to turn this on. Right. Anyway, I was saying. So the first fall is the realization of natural unsafety, which is interesting to consider in light of historicism, or at least the initial inspiration of historicism, you could say, and the realization of existential unsafety, namely the impermanence of everything. And as certain social contract philosophers later did, Lucretius adhered to a natural process depending primarily on providence. Yet Lucretius does not take the state of nature as a reference really in any other way than presumably the fact that people pursued pleasure in those days. The naturally pleasant society is unnatural because it both precedes cultivated reason and does not have space for it due to lack of leisure. So the city is unnatural because it denies reality and employs compulsion, yet philosophy is essential to man's nature but unavailable to man in the state of nature, which is, I try to work this out, but it's confusing. So there are essentially two worlds for Lucretius with their respective pleasures, which is the world of now, which is full of pleasant things which are perishable, and then there's the sort of the world of metaphysics, the realm of atoms, which is dead but permanent, and the contemplation of this realm is a pleasure that cannot perish. Yet men are not immortal, so why would philosophy be the most genuine pleasure? Men lived in a world before philosophy, and they pursued pleasure in that world. That is supposed to be their natural state, and philosophy came about in a city which is full of compulsion and non-naturalness. So that's really the problem that I could pinpoint there, which is that there's really two worlds in their pleasures, and they cross over in ways that don't make sense. So Strauss, meanwhile, has us take this for granted as authentic conventionalism and jerks right to this vulgar version attributed to Thrasymachus, and we know it all too well. Strauss briefly inserts Hobbes to the effect that finally life itself is a lesser good compared to the good life which the city hampers for the sake of life as such, but yields upon deceptive exploitation by a living. So Hobbes says that the city is necessary for life, but then the conventionalists or at least the vulgar conventionalists say that really you need to, the city blocks a good life, but if you exploit the city, then you can live the good life. So this makes the tyrant the most blessed person who can cast off the yoke of justice altogether and live life as is natural, but not for men per se, but for him alone, because he has the power to do that. Indeed, a vulgarization of Nietzsche long before he even existed. So, Lucretius represents philosophical conventionalism. The city opposes the fundamentally natural way of life, which detaches man from the world for the sake of commitment to life, which is the city's preoccupation. And so Thrasymachus bears the banner of the vulgar version of this. The city obscures the natural way of life, which allows man to cling fully to this world and commit to life in the most pleasant way. The materialist philosophy appears oddly spiritual compared to the vulgar version. Strauss says that the most important difference is that philosophical selfishness involves no will to power at all, which it would consider vulgar and opinion-bred. So where do these opinions come from? The sophists are singled out as the perpetrators. They painted a slogan on the original teachings so that those would justify the price tag they provided them with. They made conventionalism compatible with a this-worldly, city-dwelling mindset by omitting the final step, so to speak, which is the philosophical apathy, and replacing it with a purposeful, intellectual sort of cunning. As Strauss states it, what the sophist loves is really the prestige of wisdom. So the difficulty, of course, is that vulgar conventionalism is not a doctrine you can teach without falling short of it yourself. It is hence more salutary for the sophist to teach that which his ignorant subjects would happily regard as wisdom. They are more like rhetoricians arguing for whatever is in vogue. Strauss hence says that there is no sophist teaching per se. It's just, let's say they are pretending to be yielding the fruit of the plant that was already growing, or whatever the Nietzschean quote is. So Strauss then treats of the myth of Protagoras in brief and isolated fashion. And I do not understand the point of doing that. I can point out that he points out three main aspects, namely nature, arts, and convention. Nature, he says, is really two different things, but then equates them to each other. Apparently a dark cave is fundamentally the same thing as thought following production. If we imagine the allegory of the cave, we can see how Plato might have thought that too, but in that analogy, nature is posited as fundamentally intelligible, whereas this myth assumes materialism. So art is described as the rebellion of Prometheus. But what was it that these divine beings wanted in the first place? Justice is Zeus's quoted gift to all, which requires only a show of justice in order to be valid. If it requires something, it is of course not a gift, and if it need not be applied, then it is not likely to be universally just. So at any rate, we should not consider this to be an authentic conventionalist doctrine apparently being laid forward by Plato here, as it is ascribed to the most famous sophist. It appears to have both the subversive character of philosophical conventionalism as well as the vulgar conclusion taught by the sophists, namely that you can have an appearance of justice, and that's good enough to be blessed by this Zeus. Strauss steps right past it after he puts this down, and I have no clue why. He did the same thing to Lucretius. He puts that whole thing down and he says, anyway, here's this other thing. I don't know why. So I'm going to zip right past it too. Strauss continues with a remark on pre-Socratic natural right, or so he says. He says that he's not going to talk about any particular Socratic doctrine at that point. But he then says that he will sketch such a doctrine which has been rejected by the classics, which I take to mean that he is talking about a Socratic doctrine, and not a pre-Socratic doctrine. I don't know. The doctrine he sketches out, however, is that of egalitarianism, the premise that if men are naturally free, they must be naturally equal. This, which I don't know if that's a Socratic teaching, this could hence be considered a doctrine of original human perfection and a later corruption that culminated in the forcibly hierarchical city. When you have something like that in a republic, but obviously that's not a Socratic teaching, that's a dialogue. Civil society would therefore ideally be consent-based. And that's not a Socratic teaching at all. For as far as I can tell, Strauss specifies that one should not assume that such a doctrine would be political in intent, as it would be in the case of a modern like Rousseau, but rather a theoretical reflection on the nature or legitimacy of society itself. The moderns dropped the equation of the natural and good, therefore their contractualism did not depreciate but inform society more directly. Alright, so next, in Plato's Crito, which is a very gentlemanly work, Socrates presents himself as owing a duty to the city on account of a contract of mutual benefit. Socrates would be afforded protection and cultivation in exchange for submission, which again is not a teaching, it's something he says to Crito for a certain reason. Now in the Republic there is no contract. Strauss says that this is because the city in the Republic is a natural city, but no Straussian reading of the Republic would warrant that conclusion. The Republic is a city that requires all sorts of compulsion from beginning to end, particularly when it comes to the issue of philosopher kings. So, the fact that the Republic is a city according to reason doesn't necessarily explain the absence of a contract, because in fact there is a contract in the Republic, and it's between the philosophers and the people of the city, perhaps mediated by the rhetoricians. But okay, we have some footnotes here. So we're going to go to Crito 50 C4. I have a bookmark. There it is. Alright, let's just read 50C. Socrates, very well, and if he obeys this one, disregards his opinion and his praises while valuing those of the many who have no knowledge, will he not suffer harm? Crito says, of course. Socrates, what is that harm? Where does it tend? And what part of the man who disobeys it does it affect? Who disobeys does it affect? Crito says, obviously the harm is to his body which it ruins. Socrates, well said. So with other matters, not to enumerate them all, and certainly with actions just and unjust, shameful and beautiful, good and bad, about which we are now deliberating, should we follow the opinion of the many and fear it, or that of the one, if there is one who has knowledge of these things, and before whom we feel fear and shame more than before all the others, which is the wise man in this conversation. If we do not follow his directions, we shall harm and corrupt that part of ourselves that is improved by just actions and destroyed by unjust actions. Or is there nothing in this? And this part that he talks about, according to Strauss, is the soul, which is explicitly not mentioned in this, which is intentionally never mentioned, but always alluded to in this dialogue. So, all right. So how does this relate to the footnote? Socrates presents himself as a duty, a kind of contract of mutual benefit. But here we see that really there is no benefit in submitting to opinion, because really the benefit is in wisdom, which benefits the soul. So I don't know how that connects to the. Oh wait, we have to move. We have to go until 52. Or do we have to go until 52? Am I even in the right thing? let's just okay, so we've read 50C4. Let's read 52E56. 52E. Right, let's read some more for some context. Socrates says, doing people harm is no different from wrongdoing. Crito says that is true. Socrates, one should never do wrong in return, nor do any man harm, no matter what he may have done to you. And Crito, see that you do not agree to this, contrary to your belief. For I know that only a few people hold this view, or will hold it, and there is no common ground between those who hold this view and those who do not, but they inevitably despise each other's views. So then consider very carefully whether we have this view in common, whether you agree, and let this be the basis of our deliberation, that neither to do wrong nor to return a wrong that is ever correct, nor is doing harm in return for harm done. So okay, so that's a very let's say a very non-political approach to justice. That is the context. So now, moving on to E. Or do you disagree, or no, that's not E, or do you disagree and not share this view as a basis for discussion? Alright, so let's see if the city wants justice and the philosopher is a man who never harms anybody, then there's a stark difference between those two. So now on to 52E. I have held it for a long time and still hold it now, but if you think otherwise, tell me now. If, however, you stick to our former opinion, then listen to the next point. Quite I stick to it and agree with you, so say on. Socrates, then I state the next point, or rather I ask you, when one has come to an agreement that it is just with someone, should one fulfill it or cheat on it? Aha. Crito said one should fulfill it naturally. Wait, am I finished with this yet? One should fulfill it. See what follows from this. If we leave here without the city's permission, are we harming people whom we should at least do harm to? Who we should at least do harm to, and are we sticking to a just agreement or not? I cannot answer your question, Socrates. I do not know. Look at it this way. If, as we were planning to run away from here, or whatever one should call it, the laws and the state came and confronted us and asked, tell me, Socrates, what are you intending to do? Do you not, by this action you are intend to destroy us, the laws, and indeed the whole city, as far as you are concerned? Or do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force, but are nullified and are set at naught by private individuals? What shall we answer to this and other such arguments? We're going way over, by the way, for many things can be said, especially by an orator on behalf of this law we are destroying, which orders that the judgments of the courts shall be carried out, and blah blah blah, and Crito agrees. So what? The idea is that that if you do not want to harm people, then you have to stick to the contract, basically, and that includes the negative end of the contract. So if you have some sort of perceived transgression, whatever it may be, whether it really is one or not, you're part of the contract, so you have to fulfill that part too. And if you don't, then you harm the city, and that's bad. So how does that relate to, right, owing duty to the city and the kind of mutual benefits? So okay, so the former portion contradicts the latter because we do not conform to opinions, because this does not benefit that which is affected by justice and injustice. But then later he says we have to submit to the city because we destroy the city and the people who are living in it by being unjust. So that contradicts, and you can see why. Because there's basically the latter holds the city to be good and to benefit you, and the former holds the soul to be good and to benefit you. So that's interesting. I don't know what to make of that precisely, but it's good that we've read it. Then there's the Republic, 519. E8. E1. Alright, my friend, we'll just read E. My friend, you have again forgotten, I said, and this is Socrates, I think, that it's not the concern of law that any one class in the city fare exceptionally well, but it contrives to bring this about in the city as a whole, harmonizing the citizens by persuasion and compulsion, making them share one another the benefit that each is able to bring to the commonwealth. It's not a concern of law that any one class in the city fare exceptionally well, but it contrives to bring this about. So we shouldn't. So it isn't the job of the law to make people fare well, but it has to do that. Did any one class right? So here's then the idea that in a good city, it's not the ruler's benefit, but the law benefits the commonwealth through making all the citizens basically by making them share a benefit and having a commonwealth. And then there's, I have to read 520 E1. Or should we just read all of it? Yeah, let's just do that. That's true, he said. I did forget. Well done, Glaucon. Socrates, I said, consider that we won't be doing injustice to the philosophers who come to be among us, but rather that we will say just things to them while compelling them besides to care for and guard the others. We'll say that when such men come to be in the other cities, it is fitting for them not to participate in the labors of those cities, for they grew up spontaneously against the will of the regime in each, and the nature that grows by itself doesn't owe its rearing to anyone, that grows by itself and doesn't owe its rearing to anyone, has justice on its side when it is not eager to pay off the price of rearing to anyone. But we have begun for yourselves and for the rest of the city, like leaders and kings and hives, you have been better and more perfectly educated and are more able to participate in both lives. So you must go down, each in his turn, into the common dwelling of the others and get habituated along with them to seeing dark things. And in getting habituated to it, you will see 10,000 times better than the man there, and you'll know what each of the phantoms is and of what it is a phantom, because you have seen the truth about fair, just, and good things. And thus the city will be governed by us and by you in a state of waking, not in a dream, as many cities nowadays are governed by men who fight over shadows with one another and form factions for the sake of ruling, as though it were some great good. But the truth is surely this, that city in which those who are going to rule, or at least eager to rule, is necessarily governed in the way that is best and freest from faction, while the one that gets it, the opposite kind of rulers, is governed in the opposite way. Most certainly, he said. Do you suppose that our pupils will disobey us when they hear this and be unwilling to join in the labors of the city, each in his turn, while living the greater part of the time with one another in a pure region? Impossible, he said, for surely we shall be laying just injunctions on just men. However, each of them will certainly approach ruling as a necessary thing, which is the opposite of what is done by those who now rule in every city. Okay. So that's quite a bit, and I'm sort of running out of steam here, and my voice is getting tired. Man. Alright, so it begins with the idea of a commonwealth which men have to submit to. Then the philosophers were just men have to be a part of this commonwealth because they benefited in a very great way by ruling it properly and hence making it a better commonwealth. Let's say that such men come to be in the other cities. The philosophers did not have a part in the cities. They didn't necessarily. They grew up spontaneously against the law. The nature that grows by itself. It doesn't. Alright, so here's the idea that a nature that grows by itself doesn't owe its rearing to anyone, as Justice Zenith said, when it's not eager to pay off. Of course, in Crito, the idea is that the philosopher does owe his rearing to the laws, and surely then here is that idea. But you we have begun for yourselves and for the rest of the city, like leaders and kings and hives. You've been more better and more perfectly. Okay, so this is in the perfect city already. Yeah, because we are in book 7. So in the perfect cities, the philosophers are still philosophers, so they might not want to rule, but in the perfect city they are philosophers because the city educated them to be philosophers, and hence they're part of this commonwealth, and they have to contribute to that, even if it is just for the sake of necessity. And the fact that they do it for the sake of necessity makes it more just, because they're not chasing phantoms, which is to say the benefit of rule, but they're ruling for the sake of having a good city that can philosophize, basically. So how is that different from the Crito passage? Well, I suppose there's the same thing. It's Crito starts with the sort of independent soul, whereas this portion of the Republic starts with the Commonwealth, and the Crito portion ends with sort of the idea of submission to Commonwealth, which the Republic also does. And the Republic tries to synthesize the soul and the city by saying that in the ideal city, the city sort of begets the soul, as it were. The city begets wisdom, because it has philosopher kings, something like that. So, alright, the final statement, which might clear this up somewhat. Only allegiance to an inferior community can be derivative from contract, and I would say such is the nature of most Socratic dialogues. An honest man always keeps his promises, regardless of whom he makes them to. This sounds like the end of the Republic, which is an appeal to quote-unquote ordinary morality, painting the philosopher as saintly sage. Of course, the philosopher knows exactly which promises he has to make and to whom they must be made in order for him to be able to remain a philosopher in relative peace, and this would not be to the city. Why? Because submitting to the opinions of men harms that which benefits from wisdom and from justice and injustice, which is the soul, and hence the philosopher and the city are really not reconcilable. Okay, so there's that. And that's the end of the chapter. So the point of this chapter was to go back to the pre-scientific view of nature. Remember the beginning and the end of the chapter before this one? This had to happen because we cannot take our modern worldview for granted, seeing as it presupposes the validity of our concepts of natural categories. But rather than consider natural categories, we looked at the emergence of the concept of nature, or in other words, the way in which people came to think of things like natural categories. This is the project of philosophy, but in our age we feel that philosophy is no longer possible. Philosophy itself came about when the identification of the good with the ancestral shifted, so that the good to that of the good and the natural. We've dropped that first assumption, obviously, totally, and are uncertain about the latter premise. It could be that people think that the good is the novel or the rational, which both is and is not the same as nature, metaphysical dualism and so on, or a mixture of both, namely, that the good is the new idea or the new scientific advancement codified into administrative policy. But the ancients, at any rate, reflected on civilization in light of some conceived natural good. The conventional, according to the ancients, hid the good to at least a great extent. According to the natural right philosophers, there is an ideal regime, which is utopian because it requires ideal circumstances and exists really in potentiality. It is, however, the regime according to reason. The conventionalists say that there is no ideal regime because law itself is totally arbitrary and cannot accord with that which naturally benefits men, because man, which in itself is insufficiently shareable to be neatly organized according to law. So basically, our need for returning to natural categories is not satisfied at all in this chapter. Rather, our problem has necessitated the consideration of previous problems. Far from even preserving faith in the salvation of modern society, some of the ideas discussed here could easily drive a soft person to cynicism. And this is always the way it is with Strauss. A simple man will read and feel excited that he can follow this great mind at work. An intelligent man will taste of the aporia, but will see no way to break through the esoteric facades that he is able to identify. The true Straussians are out there chuckling to themselves, one feels inclined to think. But is that really our conclusion? Well, suffice it to say that we are now familiar with a problem that the moderns sort of discarded because they got rid of the equation of the natural and the good, which they dropped when there was this idea of a state of nature that was emancipated from or lost through some sort of historical inevitability, whatever it might be. So now we have the idea that there might not be something outside of our civilization, and maybe we can make our civilization accord with that, and maybe not. That seems to be what was in this chapter. So I don't know what I'll make the next video. I haven't really been on top of my reading game, but we'll see. I wish all of you a good week and much pleasure and good celebrations if you're going to celebrate this coming Thursday. And I'll see you next time.